Hi, I'm Bray. I'm an Australian geographic photographer, and I've also had my work bought by the likes of National Geographic and Discovery Channel, GoPro. And for the last 7 years, I've been running this photography course all around Australia. And I've finally got it together to put it online. So we're going to have a look at my top 10 composition tips, starting with what you'd think would be an obvious one. Try to make sure your horizons are horizontal, but some people just have an inability to hold the camera square, and every single photo they take is just a little bit wonky. Sometimes they say, oh, it doesn't matter, it's digital. Surely we can just rotate it and crop it later on. But you'd be surprised how much you lose in a picture when you rotate it and crop it. Just because it was all in there when it was wonky doesn't mean it'll be all in there or look any good by the time you've cropped it. You lose huge wedges off every corner. You also lose quality on your image. Obviously photos are horizontal and vertical rows of pixels, and if you have to rotate it a little bit and then save it back into horizontal and vertical rows, of course some pixels get smeared from here to here and you just lose a bit of clarity. So you're better off getting it right in shot. Rule of thirds. You've probably heard of this one before. It's a pretty important composition rule. It's basically saying that, yeah, here's a nice enough photo of a hiker walking along a beach, but for some reason this just feels a little bit nicer. It's a little more balanced. It's hard to work out exactly why, but in its simplest form, the rule of thirds is saying try not to just put your subject slap bang in the middle of the photo, as tempting as it is. It normally looks nicer if you can deliberately put your subject off on the side, give it some space in front of it. Now what's actually going on here is the rule of thirds. That's just where in your head you mentally divide your viewfinder up into these vertical and horizontal thirds and just trying to range as much as you can of your photo around those lines. So if you've got a strong horizon, you might put that on the bottom third or the top third, depending on which bit of the photo needed more space. Or if you're putting your subject off to the side, you might move them off to this third or the other third. Another example here, see it's just in the middle, it doesn't look that exciting. It just looks a whole lot nicer when you pull it off to the side. In fact, where those third lines intersect, there's 4 points in a photo there. If you can put the key bit of your image, either your subject or the key bit of your subject on those intersection points, that's a really powerful point in the photo and it looks really good. Sometimes you can have a bit of a dilemma as to which side of the photo do you put your subject on, which third. And you can just try and remember it as always try and give your subjects room to move into or see into. You know, if they're looking or moving in a direction, no one cares about what's behind them, what's been and gone. They want to see forward. So you crop out all the stuff behind them, give them extra space in front. Some people call that nose room. You know, you're just giving space in front of things. That's the same thing as rule of thirds. I think about the only exception to the rule of thirds are reflection photos, where you don't feel like you have to put that horizontal division on the top or bottom third because the symmetry of what's going on is what make those photos beautiful anyway. But I think in the vertical plane it still applies. But the key part of the photo where your eye is drawn to is obviously that tree fern. So that's in the top third corner and bottom third corner. Kind of balances it out, vaguely still fitting the rule of thirds. So try and imagine this is a view at the back of a boat that you're on and you're trying to get a nice postcard shot of this bird and the sunset and things like that using the rule of thirds. Have a think in your head how you might frame that up. Hopefully you're thinking something along the lines of that. You can see your horizon is obviously your strong bottom third, the clouds make the top third line, there's our little bird, he's the subject, he's moving into the shot, so we want to give him space to move into, so we move him off to that right hand third. But then you'll have some people jump up and down and say, oh, but you missed the lovely golden lighting over there and the blue sky up the top, what about that? And it just goes to show that the world doesn't always fit into 9 magic boxes, and you've often got to make a call between good composition and trying to fit everything in. And I really think it's always important to try and have good composition. People don't know what they're missing if you don't include it in the photo, but what you include, it's got to look nice. Framing is another good tip. This is good for your landscape photos particularly. Framing is when you deliberately include something up close in your photo. It tends to make it seem a bit more 3D, gives it a lot more depth. It also stops your eye falling off the edge of the photo. You kind of frame it or hem it in by putting something along the edges and the sides. Look at this example here. This is taken in Papua New Guinea. You can see some nice volcanoes puffing away, but it does look a little bit flat compared to this one, which just has so much more depth to it. And that's because I've deliberately got some close-up foreground elements there. As you can see, it also tends to pull our attention back towards the middle of the photo again. Stops your eye just slipping off the edge. And you probably have to admit that a lot of people make this mistake with their landscape shots where, you get to a lookout and the first thing you do is you get everyone out of the way, and if there's a fence there, you've got to get over the fence because that's in the way, and if there's a tree, you almost fall off the edge of the cliff trying to get away from the tree to cut that out, and you go to these great lengths to get an unobstructed view of the distant mountains. But then the problem is everything in your photo is a million miles away and it just looks flat. You're better off crouching down and trying to find a tussock of grass that you can pop up into that corner. Or if there's a tree there, great. Use that, frame half your shot off with that. Same with this example, sunset. Not a particularly good photo, but it was a nice sunset. But there was this stupid tree that kept on putting branches in the left-hand side of the shot, and I had to keep on edging off to the right. I almost fell off the balcony trying to get a clear view of the sky until it finally dawned on me that it's probably nicer to let that tree come into the shot. So it frames off that side of the shot, makes it more 3D, pulls our attention into the sunset, looks a whole lot better. Another one here, including those bushes up the top, just frames off the top of the shot. Check your backgrounds. This is my favorite tip from the entire course, actually. It's the easiest way to make your photos just look 10 times better without having to do any kind of complex theory or anything at all. The problem is, the human eye is really good at ignoring what's going on in the background of your photo. It's not until you get the picture back and then you'll be like, oh, really distracting element back there, and can completely ruin the shot. You know, the car coming out the back of the elephant, or it could be a power pole coming out of someone's head, or a bright yellow car in the background that's just really distracting. But the thing is, it's like another whole level of consciousness you'll finally get to with your photography, where the background is just one of the things you remember to check, and you'll be like, background. Oh wow, that's really awkward. If I just move a little bit to the side, you don't have a telegraph pole coming out of your head anymore, or whatever it is. Like this example with the lion, the lion just blends in too much with the background. It's the same color as the grass. But if you get down lower, you can get him against a bit of the sky, and he just pops out there much nicer against that blue background. So what about this example? On Kangaroo Island, I was photographing these little birds on a stick, and you kind of sneak up as close as you can get, and you think that that's probably the best place to take the photo from. But look at the background behind the birds there. You've got blue, brown, green. No matter how good your lens is at blurring it out, it's still a really terrible background. The birds are dark, and the background just behind them is dark, and they all blend in. You can't really see them. You've got to look around and say, where can I find a nice, clean, contrasting color to use as a background here? What are our choices? Really, it's just the sky reflected onto the water, that nice blue color. That'd be fantastic. So you've somehow got to get that behind your subject. Could be a case of just getting a little higher, like tippy-toe job, or in this case, I actually had to walk slightly back up the riverbank, which seemed kind of counterintuitive because I had to walk further away. But then you can get the most amazing blue uniform background that just looks spectacular. Or this one, an ant on a stick. That grey background there, that's just the road, like the asphalt on the road. But you can see there is a bit of a green glow to the side there. That's actually a leaf just out of shot. So if I move the camera about a centimetre to the right, you can end up with a green background, which looks so much more beautiful. Honestly, if you can just remember to glance into your background when you're taking a picture and just check if there's any distracting elements there, or if you can just turn a bit and get a cleaner contrasting colour, it makes a world of difference to your photos. Fill the frame. Sometimes I think photos just could do with being cropped in a little bit tighter. People have this urge to try and fit everything in, all the extremities, and often the most important part, if you could just concentrate on that, it's a much more usable photo. Look at this one. That might be the way you're tempted to take the photo because you want to fit it all in, but actually that's probably better. In fact, that is a far better composition for the shot. We all know that yachts have a big pointy bit up the top, and that's not what we're interested in this. It's just the interaction between the whale and the yacht. And now that we've zoomed in more, the subjects are bigger. It's more interesting, you can see the detail. It fits the rule of thirds, so we have the yacht on the top third intersection, whale on the bottom third, so they kind of balance there. Or this example, I was trying to keep swimming as far ahead of this lady as I could so I could turn around and get it all in shot. But if you had to summarize that photo, you'd probably say that's a woman swimming with a blue starfish. But really, this is exactly the same thing, a woman swimming with a blue starfish. But it's a much simpler, cleaner sort of shot, and it's probably more usable. You could imagine that in a little brochure on a local dive resort or something. Not that she should be picking up starfish, but compared to the other photo, there's just too much stuff going on there, too distracting. You're like, what is that yellow thing she's carrying? It's actually her shirt, but it looks like a bag. Is she stealing starfish? No, sometimes it's nicer to simplify your photo down just to the key parts, and they're often much more usable. Same with this one. I saw this lady walking down the street carrying a bunch of fish, and I was like, oh, that's interesting, get a photo of that. But then luckily, pretty quickly I realized, hang on a second, what is actually interesting here? Pretty sure it's not her wonderfully happy expression, or the fact that there's a tractor coming along. Oh, she's got no shoes on. Or there's power lines coming out of her shoulder. You got to think, what actually caught my attention here was the fact that she was carrying fish. So maybe if I zoomed in and just took a photo of fish carrying, it'd be a much more interesting shot. Even half the fish are cut out, but it doesn't matter, you can still tell they're fish. You can imagine a photo like that turning up in a little brochure about the local marketplace, whereas that other photo, it's going to go nowhere. Even a photo like this, you don't need to fit the whole thing in. You don't even need his whole head in there. It's still enough to tell that it's a beautiful shot of an elephant. It works quite strongly. So just try and remember, you don't always need to fit everything in. Crop in more, crop in tighter, often looks better. Leading lines. Now, a leading line is any line coming into your photo from the outside, and it serves to guide your eye through the photo, like this one. Your eye comes in along the railing, and then it goes out to where the people are, and you see that they're people, and you gaze out along there, and you see the rainbow, and it all just ties together very neatly. Otherwise, some photos can just feel a bit disjoint. You have to kind of look around for a while and then go, oh, that's interesting, and oh, that's interesting over there as well. It's just not as smooth. If you can link things up with a line, it often looks better. Sure, you don't always have convenient leading lines around, but if you look for them, you can often find them. And if you do have a leading line, good tip is to make sure it comes in through the corner of your shot. Leading lines always look a lot more effective if they come in exactly from the corner. Anything but eye level. This composition tip is just saying, try not to take every single photo from just normal standing up height, because then everything always just looks the same. You know, getting up high or getting down low can be a way to just add a whole new angle of interest to a photo, completely different perspective on an otherwise quite boring subject perhaps. You know, that's just a photo of Jess on a bike, not the most exciting subject in the world. But because it's taken from that really low vantage point, these are the kind of photos that stop you when you're flicking through a magazine, because your brain basically goes, yeah, I know that that's a bike, but gee, that's weird. Oh, it's taken from down. Oh, I get it. Same photo of a penguin taken at two different heights. You can really feel a different vibe in those two photos. One feels quite tall and regal, the other one feels like a little penguin shuffling around on the ground. At the very least though, if you're not trying to do some creative angle, you should always try to remember to get down to the same height as whatever it is you're photographing. So if you're photographing the family dog, get down to dog height. Or kids, because you otherwise just end up with photos where the kids are kind of having to look up into the photo and you feel very separated. So here's a photo of a gecko. Obviously that's taken down quite low, but it's not low enough. As soon as you get down to the same height as whatever it is you're photographing, you end up with a much more intimate connection there. It's just a much stronger photo. And you can see this photo is also a good example of rule of thirds. That gecko's eye, the key bit, is in that top third intersection corner. And you can see how important it is to focus on the eyes as well. So you can see the front of his nose is blurry, everything behind the eye, the rest of the body is completely blurry, very thin depth of field, but because the eye is sharp, that's all that matters when you look at the photo. Look for details. That's part of the fun of being a photographer, I think. You start to spot little things that other people didn't even notice, and then when you get a photo of it, it's amazing. People just go, how did you even see that, let alone get a picture? It's very easy to get interesting photos if you start to look for the little details. You could just be walking through your garden or a jungle or something and find the way that beautiful little leaves have little curls on the end of them, or raindrops on the back of a leaf, or the way the spores grow on the back of a fern leaf, feather details. We were out photographing Uluru a couple of years ago, and you know, the sun went down and we got some nice photos, and then we were just sort of thinking, what are we going to do now? And Jess actually spotted the reflection of Uluru in my eye, but she's got far more beautiful eyes than I do. So we swapped positions and I got a macro lens out and I took a photo of Uluru reflected in her eye. And people love this kind of photo. You know, technically it's a terrible photo. It's just about all blurry. But just because it's one of those little details that people go, wow, how did you even see that? That's a great shot. So keep your eye out for little details and textures and things like that. They can be good photos. Okay, you've got to remember to take some vertical photos as well. A lot of us just only ever take horizontal photos, and that's a bit sad because some subjects just fit a vertical frame a whole lot better. Even long sweeping landscape shots like this one, you can still have a vertical version of that and it still works. Actually, when I went on my first Australian Geographic assignment, I was reading the contract points and one of them actually said, every single thing you photograph, you must take a horizontal and a vertical version of every single thing. And that blew me away. Often one of them might look better than the other, fair enough, but you can always take both and they always work. This one, the feeling is more, wow, what an amazing open view she has out that way. Wow, wouldn't that be incredible? And the other photo is a bit more like, oh, don't stand so close to the edge. Your eye travels down the mountain instead, it feels taller. Now, if it feels awkward for you to take vertical photos, then that's a good sign that you're not taking enough of them. Maybe pretend you're on assignment for a while, and next time you're taking a picture, force yourself to work out how to make it fit nice composition vertically, take some of that as well. It'll just be good practice for you. And the last one, break these rules sometimes. You know, photography is a creative outlet. It's not like engineering where you've got your top 10 checklist and you better double check you've got every single one done, otherwise the bridge is going to fall down, you're going to kill someone. You know, photography is fun, especially with digital. You can try all these different settings and weird angles that you're pretty sure aren't going to work at all, but sometimes they do, and you're like, that looks cool. I don't know, you might hate it. I don't mind it though. You know, it sometimes still works, so feel free to break these rules. So collecting the right amount of light. You can think of it as a volume of light you've got to get into your camera somehow, and it really doesn't matter whether it all comes in at once or if you just gradually let the light trickle in, as long as at the end of the shot you've collected that same total volume, because that total amount of light is what determines how bright your photo is. That brings us to this useful little analogy. This is the size of your aperture hole here. If you make that a really small hole, obviously the light can only gradually trickle in, and it takes the camera quite a long time to collect the amount of light it needs for that correctly exposed photo. So you typically have quite long, slow shutter speeds associated with those tiny little holes. Conversely, if you open the aperture up to a really big hole, like that, the light's able to rush in very quickly, and you typically have quite fast shutter speeds associated with the large aperture holes. That makes sense to that level. But the key thing to realize here is that both of those photos are correctly exposed. They both look exactly the same in terms of brightness, but they're creatively different due to the effects of having different shutter speeds and different apertures. So for any given scene, there's actually a huge range of values you could choose, a whole bunch of different aperture shutter speed pairs that will all end up with correct exposure and the photo will look fine, but you get to choose whether you want long shutter speeds or fast shutter speeds or big aperture holes, small aperture holes to get the creative effect you want. So how does your camera work out how bright you want the photo to be? Well, it's actually very simple. Inside here there's a thing called a light meter, and when you half touch your button, and it's trying to find something to focus on, it's also looking at how bright the world is out there, and it just decides how much light it needs to collect to give your photo on average mid brightness. Halfway between being totally black and underexposed or totally white and overexposed, just on average mid brightness. Now that actually works out quite well for most photos because your typical scene actually has about as much dark stuff as it does bright stuff, and on average it's mid brightness. But of course it's not going to be perfect for every situation. Take a look at these examples. So here we have a bird in the tree that's correctly exposed, but it is actually quite bright, isn't it? There's a lot of bright sky back there. So what tends to happen in these situations is that your camera looks at the scene and goes, well, I'm going to collect enough light to be mid-brightness overall, and your photo ends up looking a little bit like this, quite dark and drab compared to what you actually wanted. We've all done this before, when you accidentally catch a window in the background of your photo and your subject is just a dark shape like that. If you think about it, that photo is still mid-brightness overall. Half the photo is black and the other half's white. But the thing we're interested in, our subject, is way too dark. So again, we need to find a way to control this exposure brightness. You've all seen this little slider indicator before. It's often on the back of your camera, even inside the viewfinder when you're looking through. It's really important. If you leave it in the middle on 0, that's when your camera is going to collect enough light for your photo to be mid-brightness on average. But if you move it down, -1, -2, it's going to collect less light. Your photo will come out darker. Or if you go +1, +2, then your photo comes out a predictable amount brighter than mid-brightness. Obviously how you change it depends on what camera you have, but most of the time you'll find your camera has a little ± brightness button on it, just like that. So generally, if you take a picture, you look at it on the back of the screen and you say, oh, I think it's a little bit too dark. So then you need to brighten it up. So you'd go hold the little ± exposure compensation in, +1, +2, take the photo again, and then hopefully it comes back looking better. Now depth of field is just the amount of stuff that's nice and sharp and in focus in your shot, in front of and behind the point that you focused on. So you can see this is a very small or shallow depth of field. We've focused the camera here, but very quickly the background becomes blurry and anything in the front becomes blurry. Whereas if you used a different sized aperture hole, maybe you'd end up with a big depth of field or a deep depth of field. And you can see here that much closer is still in focus and much further away is still sharp. And you can see the effect that has on your photos. For a photo of a person, obviously the one with the nice soft background looks a whole lot more professional because the model stands out against that soft blurry background, looks more 3D. Whereas on the other photo, where there's a larger depth of field, you kind of lose your subject against the background. It kind of feels very flat and two-dimensional. You can't really see where the hair finishes and the sticks in the background begin. It's all very kind of flat. But that's actually what you'd want, a big depth of field for a landscape photo, if you think about it. Because for a landscape shot, you want your close-up rocks and flowers to be nice and sharp, but also the distant mountains and clouds, and because everything is interesting in a landscape scene. So what actually is aperture? Well, inside your lens, it's this variable-sized hole, and you can just set that to be whatever size you want. And it's defined in these things called f-numbers, or f-stops. So you can see here, that's f8, f4, f2. As it turns out, aperture is incredibly easy. Let's have a look. If you use a smaller f-number, guess what? You get a smaller depth of field. If you use a larger f-number, you get a larger depth of field. It's pretty straightforward. Now the actual range of f-numbers you can scroll to depends on what lens you have, but some of them will go up to numbers about f40-ish and down to about f1 point something. So let's pretend f-numbers go from about 1 to 40. So this photo was taken at f2.8. So as far as f-numbers go, that's a small f-number, gives us a small depth of field, a small amount of stuff in focus. But if we used a bigger f-number, like f22, that's a big f-number, big depth of field, big amount of stuff in focus. Another example you can see here, this photo was taken at f2.8, so that's a small f number, small depth of field. You can see the background is blurry and just Jess is sharp there in the front. If we used a large f number though, like f32, you can see the difference there. The background, everything is sharp now. But back on that small f number, small depth of field, of course, if I'd focused on that bollard halfway back or something, then that bollard would become in focus, and the ones behind it would be blurry, and the ones in front of it and Jess would be blurry. Obviously, whatever you focus on is going to be in focus. The f numbers just scroll up or down that depth of field around that point. So if you're taking a photo of a thing, a person, an animal, a subject, you want to use a small f number for a small depth of field, nice blurry background to help it stand out. But if you're taking a photo of a landscape shot where you want a big depth of field, you just use a big f number, like this one, f18. So in aperture mode, you can pick whatever aperture value you want, as long as the lens is capable of it, and the camera will pick the right shutter speed to match up for it, so that you get correct exposure, or whatever exposure you've asked for. So what is shutter speed? Well, as you know, it's just how long that shutter is open for, how long the light is allowed to shine onto the sensor for. So if you use a very quick shutter speed, then nothing's had a chance to move anywhere while the photo is being recorded, so you end up being able to snap freeze even quite fast subjects like these ones. It's worth knowing that almost all of your cameras should be able to do 4,000th of a second. You can all snap freeze photos like this if you know how to control it properly. And slow shutter speeds, on the other hand, show movement blur, so anything that's moving becomes streaked across your image, and you can create some really beautiful effects. And in time value mode, you can choose whatever shutter speed you want, and the camera works out the aperture to go with it. It's just like the opposite of aperture mode. So you'd be using TV mode or S mode when getting a particular shutter speed is what's creatively most important to your photo. So maybe you really want a 1 second photo to get that waterfall, or maybe the most important thing is to have a 4,000th of a second photo to be able to freeze a bird or something like that. So ISO is basically a variable setting for how sensitive your camera is to light, how much light it needs to collect to be able to give you a correctly exposed photo. Now, ISOs go from about as low as 100, that's a fairly low value, unsensitive. That means it needs to collect an awful lot of light to be able to get you a picture. Or you could crank your ISO right up to 1600, several thousand, and then it's very sensitive. It doesn't need much light at all. Even a little brief amount of quite faint light, and the photo's already finished and give you a correct exposure. Now that's a real advantage to be able to have faster shutter speeds than you otherwise could, particularly in low light, when otherwise the photo's just too long and slow, and you end up with a lot of camera shake and you get blurry photos. Even if you have your camera on a tripod, your subjects are still moving around, so they're still blurry. Whereas if you can have a fast photo, great, you can handhold it, no one's moved anywhere, and that's great. Or even just for extra fast photos during the day. Like if you're trying to freeze a bird in flight, maybe the fastest photo you could normally take would be about 500th of a second. That's pretty quick, but it's not quick enough to freeze the wingtips on the bird. So if you turned your ISO up, you might then be able to take 4,000th of a second and absolutely freeze those wings. Now if you crank your ISO too high, you do have the downside of losing a little bit of quality in your image. It's called ISO noise. When you zoom right in on the image, you see it looks a bit gritty and grainy. You get these kind of random speckles of color. Now this is nothing like as big a problem as people make it out to be. You really only see ISO noise if you zoom really a long way in, or if you blow the picture up really huge. Now all this has been about turning your ISO up to help you get faster photos, but the reverse is also true. If you wanted to slow your shutter speed down and get really long, slow photos with lots of flowing movement in there, it helps to turn your ISO down. So the take-home point for ISO, if you like, is basically to treat it as an extension tool for your shutter speed. It's something you can completely forget about and ignore, really, until you find yourself going, gee, I just can't get a fast enough photo. Or if you're like, oh, I wanted to get a slower photo than I seem to be able to get. But to avoid noise, the idea is just to keep your ISO as low as you can. So that's it really for ISO. You've already covered aperture and shutter speed, and together those three things form what's called the exposure triangle. They're the three variables you can control to affect the way the light ends up in your photo. But in many ways, lighting is probably the most important part in photography, really. You can do as much as you want with your aperture and shutter speed and blah, 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 but if the lighting is terrible, there's almost nothing you can do to get a good photo. Let's just look at the various types of lighting you get in your average day, starting with lovely golden morning lighting. Now, as you know, morning lighting is beautiful for photography. The sun is low in the sky, so it's nice and soft. You don't have that contrast problem, the shadows are not too dark, and it has that nice warm glow to it as well. It's a really beautiful time for taking photos. While you can certainly take beautiful photos before the sun comes up as well, you've got about an hour afterwards. That's what they call the golden hour, when the lighting is just perfect. After that, pretty rapidly the sun starts to climb higher and get stronger, and you end up with harsh lighting. When the sun gets too strong, then you end up with contrast problems. So the bit in the sun is a million times brighter than the bit in the shade next to it, so the shadow just becomes jet black, or you end up blowing out your highlights, they become too bright. It's just not a good time for taking photos. Also, middle of the day, the sun is quite high, so you end up with top lighting, which means you get shadows in the eye sockets of people, and photographs of animals and things. They kind of become very bright on the top and very dark underneath. It's not a very nice direction of light either. Not a good time for taking photos. If you have to take photos in the middle of the day in the sun, you're better off going and finding some shade. Literally going and standing behind a building or something where it's just total shade lighting, because the light that gets into the shade is actually really beautiful. You don't have any contrast problems because you're already in the shade, so there's not going to be any shaded side of your subject. It's just nice and even. It's the same with cloud lighting. If you wake up and it's just a blanket cloud cover day, you might think, oh, what a boring day for taking photos. Sure, your landscape photos might look a little drab if there's too many clouds, but photographs of things like people and animals, fantastic. Cloud lighting is beautiful. It's just such a soft light, and the light has bounced off from everywhere, so it's coming from every direction at once, so it fills every little nook and cranny evenly. It's a very flattering kind of light for portraits. Wrinkles and things don't really show up. It's a great time for taking photos, and it means you can shoot all day long because there's never any harsh sunlight. Moving on then, you get to evening lighting. Much like morning lighting, I guess. The sun is low in the sky and you get that nice warm orange glow again, and the contrast problem's not there anymore. And finally, moving on to low lighting. Now, low lighting is tricky to deal with just because there's not much light around, and it's going to take the camera quite a long time to collect enough of it to give you an image. So you're going to have to expect to have quite long, slow shutter speeds. So you're going to have to hold the camera really steady, or put it on a tripod, or turn your ISO up, or a few other things. It's a little trickier to deal with, but it's worth persevering because you can get really beautiful results. Don't always let your flash pop up. So the other important factor of the lighting is not only the quality of the light, but the direction that it's coming from, because that affects the shadows, as you'll see. So let's start with front lighting. That's where your subject is lit from the same direction that you're looking at it. So there's some pretty telltale signs of front lighting. Your subject ends up being completely illuminated, so you don't have any shadows on it, of course, because if you're shining the light on the front of it, all the shadows are around the back. So it's great if you want to be able to see every detail, like for a product photo, for a catalogue or something. There's a lot of drawbacks to front lighting. If your subject is at all reflective or glossy, the light just sort of shines straight back into the camera and you get that nasty glare. Same on the skin of people, or if they're wearing glasses, or if you're trying to shoot through glass, it just bounces back at you, so it's not that nice. And the worst thing about front lighting is it tends to make your photos quite flat and two-dimensional. You can't really see the shape of things. You need some shadows for that, and that's where side lighting comes in. So side lighting reveals shape and texture through the shadows. So side lighting is good for portraits, or anything where you just want to make it look a little bit more 3D. Now, backlighting, when you're starting out in photography, people often try and avoid it because you end up with dark silhouettes and things like you saw in the exposure lecture when you accidentally have the girl in front of the window, or if you get the sun in the background of your shot and your subject just comes out as this really dark figure. But in that exposure lecture, we learned how to fix those kind of problems using exposure compensation. So you could just go +2, brighten the photo back up, and then great. So after you've learned how to deal with the problems of backlighting, it can give you some really beautiful results. It can give you a nice glow or halo around the edges of things, rim lighting. It can give you really nice silhouettes. And for people, it gives you nice highlights in the hair. So backlighting can be a really beautiful light to use. You might just find you need to overexpose the shot sometimes. So if you've got any questions or anything, you can send them through our website, chrisbrayphotography.com, or if you're on Facebook, have a look for us on there, Chris Bray Photography. We've got a group there of more than 10,000 people. Most of them have done the photography course, so it's just a great knowledge base of photographers there. You can ask questions. If you want feedback on your photos, or should you buy this lens or this one, rather than asking me, I will reply, but my answer is not necessarily correct even. But if you've got a list of 10,000 people there who are giving you feedback, the average of that probably is about correct. So it's a good resource. We try and keep it current with news, photography news, new cameras that have come out, or competitions you might want to enter. So go and have a look for us on Facebook. We're also on Instagram. If you want a beautiful photo sent to your smartphone every day or two, go and sign up on there. And then go to our website and look at all those free tutorials. As I said, we've got so many free tutorials there covering so many different topics, from things like light painting and star trails, photographing fireworks and lightning, using custom modes, flash basics, the moon, and more advanced stuff like the real difference between JPEG and RAW. And thanks very much for taking the time to watch this course. I really appreciate it.